All right. I guess we can start now. As Professor Godefroy had mentioned, I will be providing a brief overview of the current regulatory management approach for food packaging materials or food contact materials currently in Canada. Canada, I would say, sort of has a bit of a hybrid approach, as was explained for the FDA and the EU, whereas it develops both prohibitions for the use of specific packaging materials, but also attempts to provide positive lists and guidance to food contact industry members in terms of the manufacture and use of their food packaging material in Canada. So it's because of this hybrid approach, it's not totally aligned with FDA, even though we share quite a bit of commerce between the two. So in the outline of this presentation, we'll provide an introduction in terms of what type of data is required by Health Canada in terms of making an opinion about the acceptability of their packaging material. And this includes providing information about the chemical identity of the packaging material and potential uses. There's migration data that's expected from the use of packaging material. This migration data, as has been previously described, is typically used to develop some estimated exposure for the consumer. And then finally, last but not least, there is toxicology data requirements that are combined with the exposure data in terms of developing acceptability. So next slide. So it's quite interesting because Health Canada typically in its release of information that it provides for manufacturers indicate it's the responsibility of the food industry to ensure that their products comply with Canada's food standards and regulatory requirements. So essentially what Health Canada is saying is that, you know, we will provide you guidance in terms of determining the acceptability of your food packaging material, but ultimately you will be responsible for ensuring its safety and that your product meets these regulatory requirements. In Canada, there's a single overarching Food and Drug Act, and this simply provides the basis for the regulation of all products associated with basically health and safety. And this basically applies to products that are not only produced and sold in Canada, but also imported in Canada. So the Food and Drug Act simply indicates what the health and safety provisions are for food products, but this also extends to drugs, therapeutic products, medical devices, anything related to health in Canada is defined under the Canadian Food and Drug Act. So in this particular case, the Food and Drug Act being the overarching food regulation for health and safety is supported by specific regulations that are developed under the Food and Drug Regulations. So these are basically the regulations were developed for carrying out the purposes and the provisions of the Act and ensuring that they are into effect. So, and in the Food and Drug Regulations, it will specify specific issues related to food packaging use and how they may be applied to determine the health and safety of the product in question. And lastly, but not leastly, as it's sort of indicated by the bottom of the slide, there is a criminal element, and this is quite common to regulations involving safety of health products, but whether they be food or drugs or medical devices. In this case, for food, a violation of the Food and Drug Acts or regulations specific to the provisions currently would result in penalties. If there was a deliberate adulteration of a food product through food packaging, that would be up to 3 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. So, as I mentioned, the first overarching act is the Food and Drug Acts, and there's the URL associated with it. And basically, it has the umbrella provision that no person shall sell an article of food that has in it or on it any poisonous or harmful substance. So this has, after they developed this this general provision, it basically means that a manufacturer or a seller of a food product is responsible for ensuring that the food does not have any poisonous or harmful substances. So this is a relatively overarching provision, and the Food and Drug Act actually goes back quite a while. I mean, it was initially developed back in the late 1800s and came into fruition in the early 1900s, around 1919. So at that time, it wasn't considered that pesticides or vet drugs or et cetera, which can be poisonous or harmful substances, would be deliberately added to food. So there are specific provisions of the Food and Drug Act that exempt food if the substance is being added for a deliberate purpose. And that particular substance, if it has poisonous or harmful properties, is exempted if it complies with a maximum level or a maximum residue level. So specifically, in order to for food packaging to comply with this general provision that no person shall sell an article of food that has in it any poisonous or harmful substances, there's a specific division of the Food and Drug Regulations, Division 23, which is specific to packaging materials. And essentially, it provides another umbrella statement that basically means that you cannot package a food in a material if that material has the potential to transfer any substance which might be poisonous or harmful, in this case, injurious to the health of the consumer. So this next slide basically this provides a general introduction to what the current packaging material situation is, and this is in North America. So this is the type of packaging that's currently in use. You'll see minor differences in the EU and other areas of the world, but specifically this is what you tend to see in North America, so the US and Canada. The type of food that is packaged in Canada is represented by this pie diagram. And specifically, that information is used in developing the exposure assessment estimations. So how much of the particular packaging material is used with food and how much of that food is being consumed. So in this particular case, there is guidance provided to industry, essentially a guidance document, and the URL is being provided here, where industry can review and submit the necessary data for Health Canada to conduct a pre-market assessment of their chemical safety. So essentially, this information requirement for food packaging submissions, when fulfilled, basically will meet the obligations as defined under Section 4 of the Food and Drug Act and Division 23 of the Food and Drug Regulations. So if all the information is provided, it's considered to be acceptable following a review by Health Canada, then the conditions of the Food and Drug Act and Food and Drug Regulations will have been met. So any and all information submitted to Health Canada is considered to be confidential business information. So Health Canada will not share without the explicit consent of the submitter, nor will they acknowledge the existence of a submission until it's been completed. In general, what you find is that manufacturers will have to submit information about the product identity that they're using for food packaging materials, and this includes any trade name, grade of packaging material, the composition, the quantitative listings of all the ingredients in the packaging material. And that not only includes if we're dealing with plastics, the polymer, but also any materials that have gone into developing and forming the polymer, and any additional chemicals that have been added to a polymer for specific purposes. In general, also, there's a requirement that the form of the finished product be described in terms of whether it's a film, whether it's a bottle, etc. Dimensions of the packaging, thickness and volume, types of food involved, the condition of use, storage conditions, the time and temperature, the weight of the food per unit area of packaging, which has been previously described, and more importantly, the results of any migration data or extraction data that are available in order to fulfill the toxicological data requirements that might be essentially required for that particular chemical. So, as Professor Godfrey had mentioned, what we're seeing is that there's been an evolution, and this has been something that the regulatory regimes have had to keep up with. Typically, when you're talking about non-intentionally added substances, as previously mentioned, or NIAS, these were specific to monomers or oligomers that were involved in the production of the plastic material, but also specific requirements where these specific chemicals are being added only for the purpose of the packaging material itself, either to prolong its longevity or to add to its resiliency or some other factor in terms of possibly increasing the stability or usefulness of the packaging material. However, now what we're seeing, and this is part of what the evolution of food packaging materials is coming about. And if we go to the next slide, you're seeing that I think the food packaging industry is starting to skirt the rules of non-intentionally added substances, where you have specifically chemicals that are being added to packaging materials that are acting as antioxidants for the food that's being packaged. So what you're seeing is more of an intentional addition of active agents to food packaging that are having a specific effect on the food that's being packaged. So, more specifically, what you're seeing is metals being packaged in food that has, or in packaging material that has added antimicrobials, which, with the knowledge that that packaging material is going to add some antimicrobial activity to the food itself. In addition, there's foods that have a high fat content. You find they're being packaged in packaging that has antioxidants, which stabilizes the fat content and prolongs the shelf life. So we're going from an area where you're looking at specifically not intentionally added substances that are migrating, and these are associated just with the manufacturing of the packaging material, to actual chemicals that are being added specifically for interaction with the food and how to assess the migration of those. So one example I'd like to mention, and this is reflected in the Food and Drug Regulations, is that very early on, one of the first packaging materials that was developed as a replacement for glass was polyvinyl chloride. So, and I think this, the example of polyvinyl chloride really brought to the forefront the issue that chemicals from packaging material could migrate into food. Subsequent to the approval and the use of polyvinyl chloride, what was being detected in food was vinyl chloride, which is a monomeric component of PVC. So this chemical was found to migrate into food, and at the same time, the chemical was being identified as a potential human carcinogen. So generally, you'll find that the majority of regulatory agencies, in this case, will develop strict limits or derogations that will not allow the use of polyvinyl chloride if vinyl chloride is being detected as a migrant in food. And certainly this is reflected in the Division 23 of the Food and Drug Regulations, where there is a prohibition to using any PVC as a packaging material in Canada if it has detectable vinyl chloride as a migrant. So in this particular slide, what we're essentially looking at, this is a chromatogram. The x-axis is the time, so it's the minutes of the elution. The y-axis is simply the millivolts, or the detection of the signal. So what we've done here is we've used some sort of simulant in a variety of packaging material. There are specific requirements set up for migration conditions with specific simulants. Then you look at an analysis of these particular chemicals to detect the type and concentration estimate that can migrate. And the migration conditions are all set up as being relatively standard. So, and as previously mentioned, there are acceptable migrants that you can provide as coming from simulants. And these simulants are usually easier to use than actually applying the food under real life conditions, where you're actually putting the food in the packaging material and analyzing the food. What's acceptable to the majority of regulatory agencies is that you use a simulant that is designed to show the interaction between the potential packaging material and the physical chemical properties of the food itself. And typically these are things such as acetic acid and ethanol and distilled water. And in most cases, what you find is that the type of food proposed for use of the packaging material will define the type of simulant that's used in the migration. So to provide a reasonable intake estimation that can result from the use of this packaging material, essentially you have to look at the concentration of the extracted material, and this could be in an aqueous, an acidic, or a fat, or an alcoholic type of food. And then once again, look at the fraction of the total diet of that particular food that's likely to be in the packaging material. The fraction of the type of packaging material which is likely to contain the constituent, the market penetration of that particular packaging material used. And this is defined generally by surveys of the packaging industry. If you recall, the previous slide had the pie diagram, and this would be used in terms of defining what the probable daily intake of any particular migrant that's detected, as shown in that chromatogram from the previous slide. So it all goes in stages of providing the appropriate migrant to act as a simulant, detection of that migrant as a potential migrating substance, the concentration of that migrant, the identification generally through standard libraries that are used, and then the estimation of the probable daily intake, or the estimated daily intake that can result from the use of that packaging material. So this, in general, what you see is that there are huge orders of magnitude of potential daily intakes. In a lot of cases, these will become theoretical estimations based on the amount of potential migrant that's in the packaging material, the conditions of use, and the physical chemical properties of that migrant. So what we haven't sort of discussed on the previous slide is that there are specific conditions required for recycled plastics that we won't discuss here, but in general, additional migration studies have to be performed with spiking materials that are estimated to produce sort of a worst case scenario of recycled plastic uses. So this particular slide simply something that Health Canada has produced. And up until about 2012, they had assessed approximately 500 different chemicals from packaging material submissions. And as I mentioned, there's a huge difference in potential migration of chemicals, which would result in exposure estimations all the way from femtogram per kilogram body weight per day up to milligram per kilogram body weight per day. So by the time you get up to milligram quantities of a chemical in food, you're almost seeing intake estimations that are approximate to food additives. And this is, I think, belays the previous point that was made about, there are specific active materials that are being added to packaging material, which are, possibly deliberately meant to have migration because they're having a functional effect on the stability of the food and extending the shelf life of the food. So, and then I think it really comes down to the crux of the issue. You have detected all of these potential migrants from the use of packaging materials, so chemicals that are in the food packaging that could possibly migrate to food and result in exposure from consumption of that food. How do you assess the safety in order to comply with the food and drug regulations that no packaging material should impart to the food a chemical that's or a substance that's injurious to the health of the consumer? So there are definitely background documents that can be provided on this, but essentially the majority of regulatory decisions are made based on a threshold of regulation, or in other words, it's also referred to as a threshold of toxicological concern. So this is something that it's an idea that was initially proposed back in 1967, in that the toxic properties of a chemical are directly related to its structure. So initially, there was a large number of chemicals defined, almost 500, where there was a full toxicology data requirement. These could be subdivided into categories based on structural activity. And essentially, the idea is that you could define a concentration or exposure to which any potential toxicological harm has been minimized or is considered to be tolerated. And in this particular case, Health Canada relies on a threshold of regulation of 0.025 microgram per kilogram body weight per day as an intake, or 25 nanogram per kilogram body weight per day. So essentially, any migrant from the previous testing that is less than 0.5 parts per billion would result in a potential exposure of less than 0.025 microgram per kilogram body weight per day. And therefore, the petitioner could indicate that based on the threshold of regulation or threshold of toxicological concern, there is no toxicity testing requirements. So Health Canada initially developed its threshold of regulation based on a previous Red Book position that was published by the FDA, and it provides a very detailed assessment or summary of how this threshold of regulation has been developed. And this threshold of toxicological concern or threshold of regulation is continually undergoing refinement, and this refinement is being provided both by the European Food Safety Authority and the Joint Expert Committee of Food Additives, in part by World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, because the same threshold of toxicological concern or threshold of regulation is currently in use for approval of flavoring agents that are being added to food. They use the same structural activity to toxicity approach. So you'll find that in future derivations of this approach, they have developed positions specific to chemicals that are potential carcinogens. So overall, if at the end of if all the information has been submitted to Health Canada with the estimated potential daily intakes and the required toxicology data is sufficient, Health Canada will issue something known as a letter of no objection. And it's the department's way of saying you have fulfilled the requirements of the Food and Drug Act and Division 23 of the regulations, and we have no objection to the use of this particular packaging material. These low-nos have no expiry as long as their conditions of use do not change. So the chemical constituent of the packaging material and the conditions of use don't change. So the low-no is basically has no expiry date. So following the issue of that low-no, a manufacturer of a packaging material can go to food industry and say, Health Canada has provided me the basis to legally market this food packaging material. So, and what was convenient is that up until 2014, every food packaging material, including every chemical added to food packaging material, was added to a searchable database. And this is the reference listing for acceptable construction materials, packaging materials, and non-food chemical products database. And the URL has been provided there. So up until 2014, all the information from a letter of no objection was added to this database. So a potential client who wanted to purchase a packaging material for specific use, whether it be a film, a bottle, a container, whatever, could go to this database and see these are all the companies that have been provided the legal requirement to market their product in Canada, and I can accept that. There's, and this, once again, the evolution of the regulation of food packaging materials. Currently, the industry, there's been a bit of a loosening of the requirements, and that an industry representative can simply provide a letter of guarantee indicating it's sort of a self-attestation that they have information to show that the packaging material that they are attempting to market meets all the requirements of the food and drug regulations. So once again, this goes back to the initial tenet that the food industry is legally responsible for ensuring that their food packaging material has meet the requirements of the Food and Drug Act and the Food and Drug regulations. So in addition to the reference list for all materials that can be used in food packaging material, Health Canada also provides a list of acceptable polymers. So, and these polymers are broken down to every single polymeric site. And so if you are attempting to market a particular packaging material, you can look at the list of acceptable polymers. If your polymer comes up on that list, you can then look at the list of acceptable packaging materials and non-food chemicals to see whether that can be added to the particular polymer. So I would consider the current regulatory environment in Canada more to be sort of a hybrid approach where there is a defined regulatory element that specifies you have to show your packaging material is safe for use. Guidelines are provided to industry in order to develop the information, and which can be submitted free of charge to Health Canada for an assessment of the approval of your packaging material. And once again, thank you very much for the invitation and allowing me to provide a brief overview of the current situation in Canada for food packaging material use and approval.